A farmer noticed something shining in the ground and dug up a hidden steel door. When he opened it, he realized he should have never done it. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The rain had fallen through the night, heavy and relentless, until the red Georgia clay turned to thick paste beneath the boots of anyone foolish enough to step outside. By morning, the clouds had drifted off toward the east, leaving behind a swollen sky streaked with pale light in air that smelled of wet soil and iron. The storm had moved on, but its fingerprints were everywhere. The pasture fences leaning, branches scattered like bones, and the creek that ran behind the barn running higher than it had in years. For a man like Jerome Brown, it was just another morning to start over. He woke before sunrise as he always did. The house was still and cold, the kind of chill that lingered after a long night of thunder. He filled the kettle, lit the small stove, and waited for the familiar hiss of boiling water. Outside, the land stretched out in gentle humps and folds, fields the color of rust under the morning fog. His dog, Rufus, a mix of shepherd and hound, padded across the porch and waited for the sound of the back door latch. Jerome opened it, coffee cup in hand, and stepped out into the quiet. The world smelled alive again. Wet wood, damp hay, the faint sweetness of clover. He leaned on the porch rail, sipping his coffee, watching steam rise from the earth. He was 51 years old, with the posture of a man who had worked the same soil his entire life. The farm had belonged to his father, and before that, his grandfather, a patch of land that had never been prosperous but had always been theirs. The house was small, the roof patched more than once, and the tractor older than he cared to admit, but it was home. When the coffee was gone, he whistled for Rufus and started toward the pasture. The storm had been hard on the lower field. He knew that much before he even reached it. The air was still thick with the smell of rain, and the clay squelched under his boots. He checked the fence line first. 2 posts knocked down, a few wires snapped. He noted it quietly in his mind. New timber, new nails, another day's work. But it was the slope beyond the far corner of the pasture that caught his eye. The ground there had given way, a long, shallow scar where the water had carved through the hillside and exposed the earth beneath. Something glinted in that scar, a flash of dull silver against the red mud. Jerome stopped, squinting through the mist. For a moment, he thought it was a scrap of old farm equipment, a broken plow blade, maybe, or the rim of a buried oil drum. He'd uncovered all sorts of junk in this soil over the years, but as he approached, the shape grew clearer, too smooth, too deliberate. He crouched down, wiping away the wet clay with his glove. Underneath was metal thick, cold and seamless. Not a piece of machinery, but a surface, wide and flat, disappearing beneath the slope of the hill. He traced the edge with his fingers and felt the sharp line of a hinge. The realization came slowly, settling into his mind with the weight of something out of place. It was a door made of steel, set flush into the ground as if the earth itself had been built around it. He stood back, studying it. Moss clung to the edges where the soil had protected it from rust, and the corners were reinforced with what looked like concrete. It wasn't new decades old at least, but it hadn't rotted away like most forgotten things. Someone had built it to last. Jerome felt a strange unease crawl through his chest. He looked around the empty field, half expecting to see someone watching from the tree line. But there was only the wind moving through wet grass. He knelt again, brushing more mud away until the faint outline of a handle appeared, a heavy steel grip, the kind you'd find on industrial doors or military hatches. It didn't move when he tried it. The hinge was welded shut with time. He stood, wiping his hands on his jeans, staring down at it. The discovery felt private, something that belonged to him alone, and yet he wished, for the first time in years, that there was someone else there to see it. He thought of his father, who had worked this same land through drought and debt, who had known every rise and hollow of the place like the lines of his own hands. The old man had never mentioned anything like this, but there had been stories half joking, half serious about government things buried out here after the war. His father had once laughed about it over supper, saying, "They hid more secrets in this country than crops." At the time, Jerome had dismissed it. Now the words came back to him with a chill. By noon, the sun had broken through and the air was thick with heat and flies. Jerome stood there longer than he should have, the door half uncovered, gleaming faintly in the sunlight. Finally, he covered it again with soil and grass, marking the spot with a broken fence post. He told himself it was nothing important, maybe an old storm shelter, maybe part of the mining network that used to run through these hills in the 50s. He would come back with tools when the ground dried. That night, the farm was quiet again. The wind carried the scent of pine and wet earth through the open windows. Jerome ate a simple supper: beans, cornbread, and the last of the smoked ham from the cellar, and sat on the porch as dusk fell. The world around him darkened slowly, the woods turning black at the edges. He could hear the low hum of crickets rising from the grass, a steady rhythm that usually brought him peace. But his mind wasn't still. He kept thinking of the door, not what it was, but what it meant. There was a weight to it, a purpose. Someone had built it, buried it, and walked away. And for some reason, it was here, on his land, hidden for God knows how long. He tried to imagine the men who might have put it there. Soldiers, engineers, whoever they were, they'd meant for it to stay hidden. The night deepened, and clouds drifted back across the moon. He caught himself staring toward the lower pasture, even though it was far too dark to see. Rufus lifted his head beside the porch rail, ears pricked, as if he too had sensed something. Jerome reached down absently, rubbing the dog's head, trying to shake the unease from his thoughts. Inside, he set his empty plate in the sink and paused by the window. Out there, beyond the line of the barn, the land was shrouded in mist again. The pasture sloped down into the hollow where the storm had torn the soil away. And though he couldn't see it, he knew exactly where that patch of metal lay buried. He closed the curtain and turned out the light. He lay awake for a long time, listening to the creak of the old house and the distant rush of the swollen creek. His father's voice echoed faintly in his mind talk of strange noises underground, of wires buried deeper than anyone ever found, of men who came in trucks during the war years and left before dawn. He'd never believed those stories. Now he wasn't sure. When he finally drifted off to sleep, the sound of the rain returned, not outside but in memory. A steady drumming against the roof, against the ground, against the hidden metal beneath his field. It was as if the storm hadn't ended at all, just moved beneath the surface, waiting. Morning would come soon enough, and with it, the work of another day. But Jerome Brown knew, even before the first light touched his window, that he wouldn't be able to leave that patch of ground alone for long. The earth had given up one of its secrets, and a man who spent his life turning the soil couldn't simply pretend he hadn't seen it. In the silence between one breath and the next, he promised himself he'd go back, just to look again, to understand what he'd found. The thought settled deep in him like a seed in wet ground, and though he didn't yet know it, that promise would be the thing that changed everything. The field outside the window was quiet, the air still heavy with the smell of rain and clay. Somewhere beneath it, sealed away for decades, waited a door that should never have been found. And for the first time in years, Jerome Brown felt something stirring inside him that he couldn't name, part curiosity, part dread, and something darker still, the sense that his land was no longer entirely his own. He turned over, trying to sleep, but the image of that metal surface stayed with him, bright and cold against the red soil. The storm had passed, but its mark remained, hidden underfoot, waiting for him to dig again. The earth after the storm had a way of revealing what it had buried, and sometimes what it revealed refused to go back to sleep. By the time the sun rose over the ridge 2 days later, the ground had hardened just enough for Jerome to drive his truck across the pasture. The ruts from the storm were still soft, the clay sticking to his tires like blood. But the worst of the flood had passed. The air carried the damp sweetness of spring, the smell of wild onions and diesel, and somewhere far off, a woodpecker hammered at the bark of an old pine. Jerome rode in silence, the windows down, Rufus's head poking out on the passenger side, his nose twitching at the breeze. The hill where the earth had given way stood waiting like an unfinished thought, a wound in the land that hadn't healed. He parked beside the old fence and stepped out, gathering the tools from the back of the truck, a steel crowbar, a short-handled shovel, a can of oil, a flashlight. He'd spent the last 2 nights thinking about that door, and each time he closed his eyes, he saw the same thing. The dull sheen of metal under red clay, the impossible straightness of its edges. Whatever it was, it didn't belong here. Yet it was a part of his land now, and that alone made it his responsibility to understand it. The morning mist was thinning when he reached the slope. The door looked just as he had left it, except now the soil had dried and cracked around the edges, the outline more defined. Jerome crouched, brushing away the last of the debris, then poured a line of oil along the hinges. The metal hissed softly as it soaked into rust. He set the crowbar into the narrow seam and leaned his weight into it. At first, nothing happened. Then, with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep beneath the hill, the seam widened by an inch. A puff of stale air escaped, carrying with it a smell that was not quite decay, not quite earth, something metallic and forgotten. Jerome paused, listening. The wind moved through the grass above him, whispering against the wire fence. Rufus stood back from the opening, tail low, ears pinned, uneasy. Jerome took another breath and forced the crowbar deeper, twisting until the hinge gave way, with a shriek of metal against metal. The door shuddered open a few inches more, revealing darkness below. The light from the morning sky couldn't reach far inside. It was like staring into the mouth of something that had been sleeping for a long time. He pulled the door open fully, the sound echoing off the hillside. The entrance was a square shaft descending into shadow, lined with poured concrete. The first few steps were visible, a narrow staircase slick with condensation. He knelt at the edge and ran his hand along the inner wall. The concrete was rough but solid, free of cracks or rot. Whoever had built this had known what they were doing. The craftsmanship wasn't rural, it was precise, industrial, deliberate. Jerome turned on his flashlight and aimed the beam down the stairs. The light fell on a narrow corridor leading away at an angle, the walls lined with old conduit and wiring. Water dripped somewhere far below, the steady tap echoing faintly. For a moment he hesitated. He wasn't a man easily spooked, but there was something unnatural about a place like this, about standing over an open passage built by hands long gone, leading into the belly of his own land. He thought of his father again, of those old stories about men in government trucks. Maybe this was one of their projects, something they'd meant to erase, but curiosity won. He reached into the truck bed for a length of rope, tied one end to the nearest fence post, and looped the other around his wrist. Rufus whined as he started down, his nails scraping the dirt. "Stay," Jerome murmured without speaking the word aloud. The dog sat, uncertain, eyes following him as he disappeared below. The temperature dropped as soon as Jerome stepped into the stairwell. The air was heavy, unmoving, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Each breath tasted of dust and metal. His flashlight beam trembled slightly, catching on spiderwebs that glistened in the damp. The descent wasn't long, maybe 20 steps, but by the time his boots hit the concrete floor below, the daylight above had become a faint gray square far overhead. The room at the bottom was larger than he expected, maybe 12 feet across and nearly as tall. The walls were concrete, the ceiling low, the floor smooth and solid. There was no decoration, only utility. Against one wall stood a metal desk with drawers left half open. A few sheets of paper lay scattered across its surface, their edges curled and yellowed. Next to the desk was a bank of equipment machines Jerome didn't recognize at first. Dials, rotary switches, a small cathode screen, and coiled cables that led into the wall. The machines were old from another era, but still intact. He ran his fingers along the desk, disturbing a thin layer of dust. His light fell on a faded stencil on the wall, a string of numbers followed by the letters U.S. Property, Signal OPS. The paint had peeled, but the words were clear enough. A signal station. Maybe part of the defense network that had once crisscrossed the country during the Cold War. He'd read about those years in the newspaper archives, underground monitoring sites built to withstand nuclear attack, later abandoned when satellites made them obsolete. But why here? This was farmland, miles from any military installation. On the far side of the room, a metal locker stood slightly ajar. Inside were rolled blueprints, sealed tubes, and a small tin box stamped with the same government insignia. Jerome opened it carefully. Inside, under a cracked layer of glass, lay a faded photograph, 4 men standing beside a military truck. Their uniforms were plain, No insignias visible, but one of them held a clipboard, and behind them loomed a structure that looked disturbingly familiar, a steel door, half buried in clay. He turned the photo over. Scrawled in pencil on the back were the words, Site 12, 1962. He stared at it for a long time. Site 12. The same number stamped on the stencil above his head. There had been more of these places, maybe dozens, maybe hundreds, hidden in the folds of the countryside, forgotten by everyone but the men who built them. He imagined those workers, the trucks rolling in under cover of night, pouring concrete by lantern light, sealing up whatever purpose this room had served, then leaving it to the soil. Jerome's flashlight flickered as he leaned closer to the machinery. The air smelled faintly of oil and something chemical. Dust coated the switches, but the layout of the panels was careful, almost elegant. He brushed at one of the control boxes and felt a static charge against his skin. That shouldn't have been possible. There was no power here, no lines, no generators. And yet the faint hum that filled the space wasn't his imagination. It was real, low and constant, vibrating through the floor like a heartbeat. He stepped back, scanning the ceiling for cables. They vanished into the concrete, swallowed by the wall itself. He reached for one of the drawers in the desk and pulled it open. Inside were folders labeled in block letters. Com log, site report, transmission record. The papers were brittle, the ink faded to sepia. Most of them were technical notes frequencies, weather conditions, coded phrases, but one caught his eye, civilian observation points. The term repeated across multiple pages, paired with coordinates that looked familiar. Too familiar. He folded the page and slipped it into his pocket. He'd study it later. For now, he needed to know more about what kind of place this was. The flashlight beam wandered over the far wall, and that was when he noticed a door-shaped outline there, smaller than the one above ground, sealed tight. He tapped it with the crowbar. Solid steel. No handle. No lock visible from this side. Whoever had used this room had kept something else behind that door, something they hadn't meant for easy access. He felt a surge of unease then, stronger than before. It wasn't fear of what was inside. It was the realization that he had crossed a threshold, that the moment he stepped through that first door in the hillside, his world had changed in some irreversible way. This place had been meant to stay hidden. Someone at some point had gone to great lengths to bury it. Now he had disturbed it. Jerome turned back toward the stairs. The square of light at the top was smaller now, the afternoon shadows lengthening above. He made one last sweep of the room with his flashlight, memorizing every detail, the equipment, the peeling paint, the silence. Then he climbed back toward daylight. The sound of his boots on the concrete echoed like footsteps that didn't quite belong to him. Rufus was waiting at the edge of the slope, tail low, whining softly. The air outside felt shockingly alive after the stillness below the smell of grass, the cry of a hawk overhead, the warmth of the sun on his back. Jerome closed the heavy door and pressed it down until it settled into its frame. He covered the metal with soil and branches, leaving it as it had been, invisible to anyone who might pass. For a long moment he stood there, breathing deeply. The hillside looked ordinary again, the pasture stretching green and quiet under the fading light. He should have felt relief, but what he felt instead was a kind of displacement, as if the land he had known all his life had suddenly turned strange. He looked toward the barn, the fences, the farmhouse sitting small against the horizon. It was all still his, and yet it wasn't. Beneath it now ran something else, corridors, wires, a history he had never been told. As he walked back to the truck, the crowbar over his shoulder, he felt the first trace of unease settle deep inside him, like a splinter he couldn't reach. He told himself it was over, that he'd seen enough, but part of him knew better. You don't open a door like that and simply forget it. The earth remembers, even when people don't. And the silence down there, the hum in the walls, felt less like abandonment than waiting. He glanced once more over his shoulder before driving back up the ridge. The slope was quiet, the metal buried again beneath its blanket of soil. The wind rippled across the grass, whispering over what he had unearthed. Whatever story had been sealed there, It had just begun to tell itself, and Jerome Brown, whether he liked it or not, had already stepped into it. The following night, the wind turned colder. The rain had passed, but the smell of it still clung to the air and to the timber walls of the old farmhouse. Jerome sat in the barn, the single bulb above his workbench throwing a yellow cone of light over the table. The dog slept near the door, his chest rising and falling with slow rhythm. Spread before Jerome lay the papers he had taken from the underground room, weathered pages, their edges frayed and curling like leaves that had been buried too long in the ground. He had waited all day before touching them again. He'd spent the morning fixing the fence, mending a water line, forcing himself into the rhythm of ordinary work. But the images from beneath the earth wouldn't leave him. The cold air, the concrete walls, the faint hum that had followed him even after he stepped into sunlight. By afternoon, he found himself glancing toward the slope every few minutes, drawn by something he didn't yet understand. He knew that if he returned, he might not come back the same. So instead, he brought the past up with him. The first papers were technical, filled with numbers and strange abbreviations he didn't recognize. Frequencies, coordinates, signal logs. The ink had faded to brown, and the pages smelled faintly of mildew and oil. One folder contained a set of blueprints, drafted with military precision, rectangles, lines, measurements written in neat block lettering. At the top of each sheet, a simple label repeated, U.S. Communications Network, Site 12. The date below it read 1962. Jerome traced the lines with his finger, following the outlines of the structure he had seen with his own eyes. But there were more rooms drawn here than he had entered. Corridors that extended deeper underground, chambers that connected to other facilities miles away. The network wasn't local, it was regional, maybe national. The second folder was stranger. Inside were pages stamped with the words, Observation Records, Civilian, followed by lists of names and corresponding coordinates. He didn't recognize most of them at first: farmers, merchants, families who had lived in the county decades earlier. But near the bottom of one page, his breath caught. Brown Herald, Zone 12B. His father's name. The location matched his own property, the very field where the steel door lay buried. Jerome sat back, staring at the words until the letters blurred. His father had died 20 years ago, long before anyone spoke of satellites or data collection. Why would a government record from the 1960s list him or this land as part of an observation zone? He turned the page over, half expecting an explanation, but there was nothing but another list of coordinates and dates. He rubbed his forehead, trying to think clearly. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the Brown on that list wasn't his father at all, but deep down, he knew better. His father had always been uneasy about the government. He'd refused to take federal loans when the drought hit, refused to sell his land when companies came asking to build transmission lines across it. Jerome remembered arguments late at night, muffled through the thin walls of the house, his father's low voice repeating the same phrase, "They're not done with this place." At the time, Jerome had assumed he was talking about taxes or developers. Now he wasn't so sure. He opened another file, this one marked Incident Reports. The handwriting was different, tighter, more urgent. Each report detailed a minor occurrence. Unauthorized activity near perimeter. Subject 4B approached restricted boundary. Observation post compromised reassigned monitoring. The dates spanned nearly a decade, from 1961 to 1970. Whatever the project had been, it hadn't ended quickly. At the bottom of one page, scribbled in pencil, was a note that chilled him more than the cold air seeping through the barn walls. Civilian awareness increasing. Recommend closure of site. The word closure was underlined twice. Jerome turned off the lamp for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the dark. Outside, the night was alive with crickets and the occasional croak of a frog by the creek. The normal sounds of his land, the ones that had always comforted him, now felt different, as though the whole place were listening back. He imagined men in uniform standing on the same soil 60 years ago, mapping the trees, driving stakes into the ground, building in silence. The earth had swallowed their work, but not its memory. He switched the light back on. There was one last envelope among the papers, smaller and sealed. He slid it open carefully. Inside was a single photograph, faded but clear enough to see the outlines of the old farmhouse. His farmhouse, though it looked newer then, its paint bright and fresh. In the foreground stood two men in civilian clothes beside a black sedan. Neither smiled. One of them held a clipboard. Behind them, across the pasture, the same slope rose smooth and untouched. There was no sign of a door. But in the lower corner of the photograph, written in blue ink, were the words "Surveillance Point, activated 3/12/64." He set the picture down slowly. The date was the year after his father's name appeared on the list. The realization hit him with a dull weight. This wasn't just an old installation. It had been used actively, deliberately to watch. And not watch enemies, but ordinary people. He gathered the papers into a stack, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. He hadn't told anyone what he'd found. There was no one to tell, really. The nearest neighbor lived 3 miles away. The sheriff's office was 20 minutes down the road, but Jerome couldn't imagine walking in with these files and asking for help. He didn't even know what he'd be accusing anyone of. The men who built this place were long gone. The project, whatever it was, had been buried for half a century. And yet he couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, still cared about keeping it buried. He slipped the photograph and the document with his father's name into an old tobacco tin. The same one his father used to keep coins in. He hid it under the loose floorboard near the stall, then sat back down at the workbench. The bulb above him flickered, the faint buzz of electricity filling the silence. He stared at the blueprints, the clean lines that mapped out the underworld beneath his own field. In the upper right corner of the largest sheet, a faint stamp read, "Confidential Clearance Level D." Below it was a signature too faint to make out. Jerome tilted it toward the light. The ink had bled over time, but the letters were still there, looping in a hand that was both careful and hurried. The last name looked like Rogers, or maybe Rogers. He whispered the name under his breath without realizing it. The dog stirred, raising his head and staring toward the open barn door. Jerome followed his gaze. The yard outside was still, lit only by the pale glow of the half-moon. The wind had died completely, and yet the tall grass near the fence seemed to move. He waited, not breathing, until it stopped. Then he told himself it was just the night, just the play of shadows and nerves. He'd been alone too long. A man who lived by himself learned to doubt his own senses. Still, he couldn't shake the unease that crawled up his spine. He gathered the remaining papers, folded them neatly, and tucked them into a canvas sack. He'd take them into the house before he slept. He didn't know what kind of secret he'd stumbled onto, but it was no longer something he could dismiss as a relic of the past. Back inside, he spread the papers across the kitchen table, sorting them by date and subject. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, the steady rhythm filling the silence. The house felt smaller tonight, as though the walls had drawn closer around him. He ran his finger down another list of coordinates and realized that some of them formed a pattern, small clusters of sites all within a 50-mile radius. If he overlaid them on a map, he might see something more. He fetched an old county atlas from the bookshelf and began marking the points with a pencil. By the time he finished, his coffee had gone cold, and a rough shape had emerged on the page, a line of observation posts stretching across the southern part of the county, each about 10 miles apart. And right in the middle sat his land, Site 12, the hub that connected them all. Jerome leaned back in his chair, the full meaning slowly settling in. His farm hadn't been chosen by accident. It had been central strategic. For decades, his family had lived atop something designed for control, surveillance, maybe even deception. His father's mistrust of officials, his refusal to sell, his long silences about the past, they all made a grim kind of sense now. The clock struck midnight. The sound made him flinch. He folded the map, slid it into the tobacco tin, and hid it with the others. Outside, a faint mist was rising over the field. The world looked unchanged, quiet, peaceful, like it always had. But Jerome Brown knew that the earth beneath those calm pastures wasn't innocent. It held wires, records, and intentions that had nothing to do with farming. He turned off the kitchen light and stood by the window for a long moment, staring out into the dark. The slope was just visible in the moonlight, smooth again after he'd covered the door. Somewhere under that patch of ground lay the room with the humming machines, the desk, and the empty chair. He wondered if the equipment had ever really turned off. If maybe the hum he'd heard wasn't the echo of the past, but something still alive, still listening. When he finally went to bed, he left the lamp burning in the hallway. The night pressed against the windows, and the wind whispered across the roof like distant voices. The farm had always been a place of work and solitude, a refuge from the noise of the world. Now it felt like the opposite, a stage on which something unseen had been watching for decades. He didn't know what he was going to do about it yet, but he knew one thing for certain. The next time he went back down there, he would not be unprepared. By the end of the week, Jerome could no longer tell where habit ended and watchfulness began. The days unfolded as they always had: feed the livestock, mend what the rain had broken, drive into town for fuel and supplies. But beneath every small movement ran a quiet tension, a hum that had nothing to do with work. Ever since he had found his father's name on that list, the land no longer felt like his own. He'd catch himself looking toward the lower field as though it might shift while his back was turned. Even the air seemed different now, as if it carried whispers from the ground beneath his boots. It began with little things. On Tuesday, as he was closing the barn for the night, he noticed a faint set of tire tracks cutting across the back road, leading toward the creek where no one ever drove. The mud was still soft from rain, and the tread was new, too new. 2 nights later, he heard an engine idling somewhere near the edge of his property. When he stepped outside with a flashlight, the sound vanished, leaving only the frogs and the distant rush of the river. The next morning, the grass along the fence line was flattened, and the lock on the north gate hung twisted but unbroken, as if someone had tested it and decided against forcing their way through. Jerome said nothing to anyone. He had no one to say it to. The men at Henderson's hardware store would only laugh and say city people had started exploring the countryside again, or that kids from town were joyriding on the back roads. But Jerome had lived here all his life. He knew what the land sounded like, how it moved, how it breathed. This was something different. This was someone trying not to be noticed. He began keeping a small camera in his truck, the same kind hunters used to track deer. He fixed one to a fence post facing the road and another near the barn, aimed toward the lower pasture. It was a precaution, nothing more, he told himself. Still, every time he walked past the cameras, he felt their lenses staring back at him like unblinking eyes. By night, he sat in the kitchen, studying the documents again, cross-referencing the coordinates, drawing lines across maps until the pattern grew sharper. The more he saw, the more he realized how deliberate it all was. Those observation sites weren't random. They formed a network, each feeding information to a central point. Site 12, his land, had been the center, the hub. The nights grew longer and quieter. Rufus stopped barking at the usual wildlife. Instead, he would lift his head suddenly and stare into the dark. Ears twitching, low growls rumbling deep in his chest. Once, just after midnight, Jerome thought he saw a glint of light at the far end of the field, as if someone had briefly flashed a mirror or the lens of a scope. When he went out to look, there was nothing there, only the smell of damp grass and the quiet roll of fog settling low to the ground. It was around that time that he decided to take action. He'd gone as far as a man could go alone with guesses and maps. Someone else needed to see what he'd found, someone who could help make sense of it. He thought of a man he knew in town, Michael Tanner, a freelance reporter who'd grown up nearby. Years ago, Michael had written a series of pieces about government land acquisitions in the region, exposing how small farms had been bought up through shell companies. Jerome had read every word of it and respected how the man had handled truth with patience, not drama. The next morning, he drove into town with the canvas sack of papers in the passenger seat. The drive felt longer than usual, the winding roads carrying him past fields where spring corn was just beginning to rise. Everything looked ordinary, and yet the ordinariness itself unsettled him. When he reached the diner where Michael liked to work mornings, he parked across the street and waited. He didn't take the papers out until he was sure no one else was watching. Michael listened carefully, the way good reporters do when they sense a story that could be more than rumor. He didn't interrupt. He simply watched the older man talk, his eyes narrowing slightly when Jerome mentioned the underground room and the blueprints marked with official seals. When Jerome slid one of the documents across the table, the one with his father's name on it, Michael's hand hesitated before picking it up. He promised to make copies, to dig into the archives, to cross-check the names. He said it quietly, not as reassurance, but as a fact of intention. Jerome nodded. It was all he could do. The next few days passed in uneasy waiting. The farm work went on, but he moved through it as though part of him were somewhere else, listening for a phone call or a knock that didn't come. Then on Saturday morning, he stopped by the grocery and saw the week's edition of the county paper sitting on the counter. Across the front page in modest type was the headline, "Hidden Installations from the Cold War Discovered in Southern Georgia." The article was short, careful, and restrained. No mention of Jerome by name, but a photograph taken from the ridge above his pasture showed enough that anyone familiar with the land could recognize it. The piece described rumors of abandoned military outposts, local reports of sealed structures, and questions about post-war federal projects. By evening, the phone at his house began to ring, though no one spoke when he answered. Once, a truck he didn't recognize rolled past his gate at dusk, slowing before continuing down the road. The next morning, one of his cameras was gone. The post-it had been strapped to lying flat in the grass. Jerome felt the old fear rising, not for himself, but for what he might have stirred awake. He went to the barn and checked the tobacco tin beneath the floorboard. The papers were still there. He added a new note on top, a list of dates, observations, everything he'd seen since finding the door. That night, a heavy fog rolled in from the river, covering the fields in white. He could barely see the barn from the porch. Somewhere out in the haze, Rufus barked once and fell silent. The sound was sharp, cut off mid-breath. Jerome stood listening for a long time before calling the dog's name. There was no answer. When he finally found him, the animal was standing rigid by the north gate, growling low at the emptiness beyond. Jerome followed his gaze but saw only fog and the faint shimmer of headlights retreating into the distance. Sleep didn't come easy after that. The next day passed without word from Michael. By nightfall, Jerome tried calling the reporter's phone, but the call went straight to voicemail. 2 more days passed in silence. Then came the news. Michael Tanner had been found dead on Route 19. His car overturned in a ditch, the police calling it an accident caused by fatigue. The paper didn't mention the story he'd written, and by the next week's issue, the article had vanished from the online archive altogether. Jerome sat on the porch long after reading that headline, the folded newspaper resting on his knee. The air was still, and the cicadas had gone quiet. He thought of the blueprints, of the hum beneath the ground, of his father's voice warning him about men who built things that were never meant to be found. He could almost hear that hum again now, not in the earth but in the silence itself, steady and patient. The next morning, he went down to the lower field and uncovered the steel door once more. The soil came away easily under his shovel, as if it had been loosened from beneath. When he reached the metal, he stopped. The door had changed. Someone had been there. The handle, once frozen with rust, was freshly welded shut, the steel discolored by recent heat. A new seam of bright silver marked the edge where the old hinge had been sealed. He crouched beside it, touching the cool metal. It was solid, final. Whoever had come here wanted it closed for good. Jerome stood in the field for a long time, the wind tugging at his shirt, the dog pacing nervously behind him. There were no answers left to dig for, not here, not now, but in his bones. He knew that what lay beneath his land wasn't gone. It had simply changed form, the way secrets always did. They sealed themselves back into silence, waiting for the next man curious enough to listen to what the ground had to say. He covered the door again, pressing the soil flat until it looked undisturbed. As he walked back toward the house, the first evening birds began to call from the trees. The sound should have been comforting, but it wasn't. It felt like something closing in, a rhythm returning to its usual quiet after swallowing a noise it didn't like. The land around him looked peaceful, unchanged, as it always had. But Jerome Brown knew better now. What was hidden didn't stay forgotten. It just learned to hide in plain sight. The morning after the discovery of the welded door, the farm was wrapped in a strange stillness. Even the birds seemed reluctant to break the air with their usual calls. Jerome stood by the window with his coffee, staring toward the lower field where the fog was lifting slowly, revealing nothing but damp grass and the faint curve of the hill. The land looked the same as always, but he no longer trusted its calmness. He had lived here long enough to know that silence could be as heavy as thunder. Something had changed. Something was watching back. He dressed without hurry, though his hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his shirt. The dog followed him to the porch but wouldn't go farther, pacing instead by the steps with his ears down. Jerome started toward the slope, his boots sinking into the softened earth. The closer he came, the more he felt that the world around him was holding its breath. When he reached the spot, the sight confirmed what he already knew. The fresh seams of metal gleamed faintly under the pale light of morning. Whoever had welded the door had done it recently, no more than a day or two ago. The soil he had pressed flat now bore footprints he didn't recognize. One print stood out among them, a deep, solitary impression of a boot, larger than his own, pressed into the mud beside the hinge. Whoever had been here hadn't bothered to cover their tracks, as if they wanted him to see. Jerome crouched down, running his hand across the welded line. The steel was cool now, but bore a faint smell of burnt iron, and the scorch marks trailed outward where sparks had landed. He imagined the sound it must have made, that hiss of heat biting into metal while he slept, unaware. He looked toward the road that ran along the edge of his property, half hidden by trees. There were no signs of vehicles now, no tire marks in the gravel. Whoever came here knew how to disappear. He stayed there longer than he meant to, the wind tugging at his jacket, the weight of uncertainty settling deeper in his chest. When he finally turned back toward the house, he caught sight of a dark bird perched on the fence post near the gate, its head cocked, watching him. He almost laughed at himself for noticing it, for feeling that its stare meant something, but the laugh never came. He simply walked on, the rhythm of his boots against the dirt louder than usual. At noon the phone rang. The sound startled him enough that he spilled his coffee. He wiped the counter quickly and lifted the receiver. There was no voice, only a faint hum, like a breath held too close to the line. "Hello?" he said, though he already knew it was useless. The hum deepened, then cut off. He listened to the dead tone for a few seconds longer before hanging up. He told himself it was a bad connection, maybe a cross line from town, but he didn't believe it. That night the house no longer felt safe. The floor creaked in ways it hadn't before. The walls seemed to hold the air too tightly. He checked every lock twice, drew the curtains closed, and left the kitchen light on. In the hallway mirror, he caught his own reflection and barely recognized it. The lines around his eyes deeper, his skin dull from sleeplessness. It struck him that he hadn't looked at another person properly in days. The only voices he'd heard were those from the radio or his own, echoing faintly through the rooms. He thought about driving into town, finding someone to talk to, but the idea died as quickly as it came. He couldn't explain what was happening without sounding like a man who'd lost his sense. The next morning he tried to distract himself with work. The tractor needed maintenance, the feed bins needed refilling, the fence on the north line was sagging again. He moved through each task methodically, refusing to let his mind drift. But every sound, the crunch of gravel under his boots, the hum of the tractor engine, the buzz of flies carried an edge that made him flinch. The world was no longer background. It was a reminder that something unseen was sharing the same space. By late afternoon, he noticed that one of the barn doors was ajar. He distinctly remembered closing it the night before. Inside, the air was still and thick with dust, but something had shifted. The stool he kept by the workbench had been moved a few inches, just enough to notice. On the floor near the stall, a line of footprints crossed the dust feint, partial, but definitely not his. He knelt down studying them. They were small, light, the kind of prints left by someone who moved carefully. He followed them toward the back door, which hung open a crack. Beyond it, the grass was pressed flat in a narrow trail leading toward the tree line. Jerome closed the door gently and locked it. He didn't call anyone. Instead, he sat at his workbench for a long time, staring at the space those prints had occupied, his mind turning over everything that had led to this. He'd disturbed something that didn't want to be found, and now it was closing in again, piece by piece, removing evidence, erasing itself. It wasn't fear that held him still, it was clarity. The same kind of quiet acceptance that came to a farmer watching a storm approach from miles away. You couldn't stop it. You could only prepare for what it would take. That night, he slept with his shotgun leaned against the wall. Sometime before dawn, He woke to the sound of a car passing on the distant road. The engine slowed, then accelerated again. A few minutes later, he heard another sound, so faint he almost convinced himself it wasn't real. A short burst, like static crackling through the air. It reminded him of the noise that had filled the underground room, that low electrical hum he couldn't explain. He sat up, listening until it faded. Then he rose quietly and walked to the window. The field was silver in the moonlight, and in the distance the welded spot gleamed faintly through the mist, as though reflecting something invisible. The following morning, the local paper carried the news of Michael Tanner's death. "Single vehicle accident on Route 19, the headline read. Jerome read it twice, then a third time, his hands steady but cold. The article was brief, 2 paragraphs long, nothing more. It said the reporter had fallen asleep at the wheel after leaving a late-night meeting in town. No mention of the investigation he'd been working on, no reference to the article that had vanished from the archives. It was as though none of it had ever happened. He folded the paper and placed it on the counter, his eyes lingering on the ink that stained his fingertips. He thought of Michael's promise to make copies, to keep the truth safe if anything went wrong. But if the story had been erased, what else had they taken? That afternoon, he checked the hidden compartment beneath the barn floor. The tobacco tin was still there, though its position was slightly different, angled instead of flat. When he opened it, the papers were in the same order, but they smelled faintly of something chemical, sharp, and unfamiliar. Someone had handled them. Someone had been here. He stood for a long time, the tin in his hands, understanding the message that had been left for him. Whoever they were, they didn't need to steal anything. They only needed him to know they could. By evening, Jerome sat again on the porch, the rifle across his lap, watching the horizon. The sky was streaked with red, the sun sinking low over the fields. The quiet pressed down heavier than ever. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, then fell silent. The radio inside the house played softly, the voice of a preacher talking about truth and the price of keeping it. Jerome listened without hearing the words. He understood now what kind of truth this was, the kind that wasn't meant for daylight, the kind that waited underground, patient, impermanent. As darkness crept across the land, he caught one last flicker of movement at the far edge of the field, a pair of headlights flashing once, then gone. He didn't rise. He didn't call out. He only watched until the night swallowed everything, the shapes of the barn and the fence fading into shadow. The silence that followed was absolute. It settled over the farm like dust, fine and final. He felt it in his chest, in the soil beneath his boots, in the air that no longer belonged entirely to him. By the time he stood and went inside, the stars had vanished behind a sheet of low clouds. The wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of burned metal. Jerome paused in the doorway, looking back once more at the place where the door lay buried. The memory of it gleamed in his mind, cold and sealed. And for the first time since finding it, he wondered if the secret beneath his field had ever really slept at all, or if it had simply been waiting for him to listen. The morning came gray and cold, the kind of light that makes everything appear older. Jerome woke before dawn, not because of noise, but from the absence of it. The house was too still. No wind moved through the eaves. No creak from the timbers that had always whispered with the seasons. Even the animals were quiet, as if the land itself was waiting. He rose, poured cold coffee from yesterday's pot, and stood by the window, watching the pale mist climb from the fields. The welded door lay hidden beneath the slope, unseen but not forgotten. Its presence had become part of him now, a pressure beneath his ribs, something he could not unlearn or unsee. He spent the early hours in the barn, checking the generator, sharpening tools, doing all the small things that made a day seem normal. But there was no peace in the routine anymore. His thoughts moved in circles, back to the night when the welding had been done, to the silence that followed. Whoever had sealed that door had done it with a purpose to warn, to control, to erase. Yet what troubled him most wasn't the act itself, but the precision of it. They hadn't needed to break into his home or steal his documents. They had simply reminded him how small he was against whatever force had built that place. By mid-morning, he decided to drive into town. The truck engine coughed, reluctant in the cold, but eventually gave in. The road curved through the valley where fog hung low, turning familiar landmarks into ghostly shapes. Jerome had lived here all his life, yet now the land felt foreign. Each fence post, each turn of the road seemed to hide an unseen watcher. He passed two cars on his way in, both dark sedans he didn't recognize. Each time the drivers gave no glance, no acknowledgement, just faces without expression, eyes fixed straight ahead. In town, life went on as usual. The smell of diesel and fresh bread drifted from the cafe near the post office, and people were gathered in small knots on the sidewalks, talking about crops and weather and the upcoming fair. They greeted him the way they always had, polite but distant. Jerome responded in kind, but he felt apart from them now, separated by something invisible. None of them knew what lay beneath his land, what kind of machinery had hummed under their feet for decades. None of them knew how many names had been erased to keep it secret. He stopped by the library. The woman behind the counter, Mrs. Hayward, gave him a small smile, her glasses catching the light. "You haven't been in for a while," she said, her tone friendly but cautious. Jerome nodded. He wanted to ask about newspaper archives, about records from the 60s and 70s. But the memory of what had happened to Michael Tanner held him back. There was a line he could not cross again, not without cost. Instead, he signed his name in the visitor's log and pretended to browse the shelves. When he left, Mrs. Hayward was still watching him, though her expression was unreadable. Outside, the air had warmed. A breeze carried dust from the road, and the hum of a passing truck filled the silence. He glanced down the street and saw a man leaning against a lamppost reading a newspaper. There was nothing unusual about him. Plain clothes, a hat pulled low, but something about his stillness made Jerome's skin tighten. The man wasn't reading. His eyes were fixed just above the paper, following Jerome's movements. For a long second, neither of them looked away. Then Jerome turned toward his truck, forcing his steps to remain steady. He didn't drive home right away. Instead, he took the long route, circling through back roads, cutting across gravel paths that wound through the hills. Only after he was certain no one followed did he return to the farm. By the time he arrived, the sky was the color of tin. The fields glowed faintly under the late light, and the barn cast a long shadow toward the creek. Jerome parked the truck and sat inside for a moment, hands still gripping the wheel. He thought about the life he'd led before all this, the quiet years spent between planting and harvest, the days measured only by weather and work. That life felt impossibly distant now. The world beneath his land had stolen it from him. He got out and walked toward the lower field. The grass had begun to regrow over the disturbed soil, hiding any trace of what lay beneath. He stopped where the mound curved upward, the place where his shovel had first struck metal weeks ago. Standing there, he tried to imagine the men who had built it, the engineers, the laborers, the soldiers who had followed orders without question. They must have believed they were serving some greater good, some purpose that justified secrecy. But secrets, he had learned, never stayed buried. They only waited for someone to stumble across them, someone foolish enough to open the wrong door. The air smelled of rain again. He could feel the weather shifting, a storm brewing in the distance. The wind moved through the grass in slow waves, whispering across the field. He felt small, the way a man does when he realizes how little he understands of the ground he stands on. He looked toward the horizon, where the mountains rose dark against the fading light, and thought of his father, of the old man's silence, his refusal to sell, his quiet warnings that now made terrible sense. Perhaps the truth had always been close, written in the spaces his father left unspoken. He turned and started back toward the house. Halfway there, he stopped. Something on the porch caught his eye, a small envelope pinned under the edge of the doorframe. His name was written on it in neat block letters. No return address, no markings. He looked around, but the yard was empty. The road beyond the trees was quiet. He took the envelope inside and opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded once. The message was short, typed rather than handwritten. Cease inquiries, site secured, do not return. Below it, in smaller print, was a line of numbers, coordinates. He recognized them immediately. They matched the ones from the blueprints, the coordinates of Site 12. At the bottom, faintly embossed in the paper, was an insignia he didn't recognize. An eagle without stars, its wings framing a single letter. D. Jerome read the message twice, then burned it in the sink. The paper curled and blackened, the ash rising briefly before settling in gray flakes along the metal. He watched it until nothing remained but dust. Then he went to the cupboard, pulled down the tin containing the remaining documents, and stared at it for a long time. He could destroy them all now, pretend this had never happened. But that thought didn't bring relief. It brought an ache something between anger and resignation. By nightfall, thunder rolled in the distance. The storm moved slowly, the first drops falling against the tin roof with dull rhythm. He lit a lamp and sat at the table, the papers spread before him. The faces in the photographs stared back. Men in suits, names he'd come to know through reports and signatures. He imagined them sitting in rooms far from here, approving actions that would ripple through generations. He wondered if any of them had thought about the people who lived on this land, or if they'd simply seen it as coordinates on a map. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the field through the window. For a brief instant, the land glowed silver, and Jerome thought he saw something move near the hill. A shape, small and human, standing still against the rain. He blinked, but when the light faded, it was gone. He remained by the window for a long time, watching the storm until the rain softened into mist. The hum he'd once heard underground seemed to rise again in his memory, steady and low, a sound without source or end. When he finally turned away, he knew what he would do. He would leave the papers with a lawyer in town, sealed and untitled, to be opened if anything happened to him. He would lock his gates and finish the harvest as though life were returning to normal. And then, when the season turned and the fields went bare, he would leave this place behind. Some lands, he had learned, carried too much weight to live upon. At dawn, the storm had passed. The ground smelled of iron and wet soil. Jerome walked out to the field one last time. The sky was clearing, streaks of sunlight breaking through low clouds. The hill looked peaceful again, the grass glistening with dew. He stood there until the shadows shortened, then turned and walked back toward the farmhouse without looking behind him. The dog followed at his heel, silent, head low. By midday, he had packed the truck. He didn't take much, just clothes, tools, and a few photographs that reminded him of who he had been before the door. As he drove away, the road wound upward through the hills and the farmhouse grew smaller in his rearview mirror. The fields lay still beneath the light, the slope blending back into the earth as though it had never been disturbed. But Jerome knew better. He didn't glance back again. Some truths once unearthed could never be covered over, and some doors once opened would never truly close. The mountains swallowed the farm behind him, their ridges dark against the morning sun. And somewhere beneath that quiet land, deep under the soil and roots and years, the hum continued, steady, patient, eternal, singing the secret that no one was ever meant to hear. If this story kept you watching, make sure you're subscribed. There's more waiting beneath the surface. Don't miss the next video where another secret comes to light. And if you felt the chill of this one, share it. Let someone else discover what's been buried too long.